Okay, hello everyone. This is Colin Cox with Northeast State Community College, and this is the Week 1 audio lecture for English 1010. In this audio lecture, I have a couple of goals, a couple of objectives. The first one is to discuss the Essay 1 assignment prompt, say a little something about thesis statements, and then discuss the George Orwell essay, A Hanging, which I asked you to read for this week. If you're listening to this, then you clearly know and understand the importance of these audio lectures. I mentioned it in the Navigating D2L video. If you have not watched it, you should. That is on D2L. It's in Yuja, but you're listening to this obviously through YouTube. And my apologies, my dog is here, so if you hear some pattering, that's exactly what that is. So the Essay 1 assignment prompt. Now, to find this assignment prompt, go to the Content tab, select the Essay 1 description and narration module, and the prompt should be the first thing you see. And this is something you'll notice throughout the semester as we progress from one essay to the next. These prompts, think of them as guides. This is where I describe to you exactly what I want from one essay or assignment. Now, for obvious reasons, because I wanted to keep these prompts as concise as possible, you may have questions. You may want to do something with an essay, and you might be curious. Is this something I can do? Is this something I can try? In that situation, definitely email me. I'm happy to address any questions you might have. If there's a particular idea you have for an essay, do not hesitate to email me. And for obvious reasons, since this is an online class, you won't have an opportunity to ask me in class, which is often when students address or express some of those questions and concerns. This is one of the reasons why, as I emphasized in the Navigating D2L video, that communication is so important. So if you would, follow along with me. And if I didn't say so earlier, as you listen to these audio lectures, there's certainly a few different ways you can do this. I know for a lot of you, with a variety of different activities you might have outside of class, outside of college, it might be best and easiest for you to listen to this as you're at work or while you're traveling or commuting from one activity to the next. With that said, though, I would strongly encourage you to take notes, especially when I discuss the reading assignments, because the reading assignments, they are examples. They are in many ways guides, and hearing me speak about them and then having those notes, which might lead to potential questions, is extremely important. So, okay, with all that said, the assignment prompt, and I'll read this aloud, but follow along with me. For this assignment, you will write an essay using personal experience. Naturally, all personal experiences have multiple perspectives, but for this essay, focus on your perspective. Remember, a conflict does not necessarily imply an aggressive altercation, nor does it need to be severe and intense. It can be casual or even playful, as we will discuss in class. Conflicts and or arguments typically suggest an aggressive altercation, but this is not always the case. And I want to pause here and say a few things. So for this essay, and again, I think you see this idea, I think you see an example of this idea with the George Orwell essay that I asked you to read for today. You will write an essay where you will identify, explore, narrate, and describe a personal experience, but specifically an experience with a conflict as its core, or you can imagine that this conflict, that is what drives the essay itself, because there's a variety of different ways of writing an essay, and we'll address those throughout this semester. But because I want you to write a narrative essay, which is to say you'll use the characteristics of storytelling, I think all great stories, and you can imagine not just a personal experience essay, but a novel, a short story, a movie, a TV show, if a character or a set of characters have a particular conflict that is difficult or challenging to resolve, it's the exploration of that conflict, and specifically at times the challenges that characters face when they attempt to resolve conflicts, that often makes stories incredibly interesting, and it often allows an audience or a reader to experience the story in a dynamic way. Because if, for example, you like romantic comedies. Imagine a romantic comedy, but there are no barriers that prevent the two leads from fortifying their relationship. Imagine a romantic comedy where two characters meet and everything is just perfect and they have no miscommunications. There are no internal or external conflicts or problems that might create tension in that relationship. I think that would be an incredibly boring story to read, watch, or experience. This is one of the reasons why, again, if you like romantic comedies, you know this particular form or formula, which is one character meets another character, they lose that character, and at the end, they get the character back. So for this particular essay, you will select a personal experience where you encountered and confronted a particular conflict. And if you pay attention to the language I use in the prompt, I think what's important, and I think students often understandably do this, they think, well, I need to select maybe the most dramatic thing that's ever happened to me. But I do not think it needs to be like that. I'll offer an example. I had a student in one of my 1010 classes a few years ago write an essay in response to this prompt. And they wrote about how they went to Pal's, this local fast food restaurant. They ordered, I recall, 2 hot dogs, I think. And for whatever reason, the restaurant in question, the Pals, only gave them 1. And so they did what any of us would do. They turned around and they said, hey, you only gave me the 1 hot dog. And apparently the employee accused them of lying. The employee accused them of rapidly and quickly eating one of the hot dogs only to then, I suppose, get a free hot dog. Even as you hear me describe it, this is like the silliest thing I've ever heard, right? But it was an excellent conflict to choose for this essay because how many times, whether you are someone who works fast food or in customer service, how many times have you had what felt like a trivial conflict and disagreement with a customer? I think there's something so ubiquitous about these sorts of conflicts. And I think that's what this student did that was so interesting. They chose something universal and tried to find something unique within this ubiquitous universal experience. So while, again, your instincts might tell you, I need to pick, I don't know, the biggest, most dramatic argument or conflict that I've ever experienced, you can do that, but don't discount the potential that might exist in these common ubiquitous experiences. And again, think back to the example that I just gave you. I'll continue reading from the prompt now. Use descriptive, carefully chosen language while writing or building this essay, but remember that this essay must have an argumentative purpose. That is to say, I want you to be rhetorical and persuasive. This is usually called a thesis statement, but you can think of it however you like. In summary, here is a checklist of what I want to see in this essay, and I'll pause here one additional time. So everything you write for this class, all of the essays that you will submit need to have a thesis statement. And this is an idea and a concept that I will return to often throughout the semester. But here at the beginning of the semester, this is what I'll say about thesis statements. There are a variety of different ways to describe what a thesis statement is. If you learn nothing else from this class than what a thesis statement is, or if this class increases your comfort with knowing and understanding what a thesis statement is, I think you've learned a lot, because thesis statements, understanding them, grasping them, can be incredibly challenging. So a thesis statement, imagine that it is the main point that you want to make and support throughout your essay. It is the claim that you hope to stake. It's that big idea that your essay works to develop and unpack. And connected to it, and this is why I use a word like rhetoric, which is to say, quite simply, the art of persuasion. Ideally, you will introduce, develop, and support a thesis to the point that whoever reads this will think, okay, I think I agree with that. I think that's right. This is what good thesis statement writing and development does. Perhaps in some cases, in situations, it persuades a reader off of a previous maybe position or perspective, and it moves or shifts them to a new position or perspective. And in this scenario, that perspective or position would be your thesis, your perspective, your position. So how this works in a narrative essay is different from other kinds of essays. And again, I think the Orwell essay is a great example of this. So thesis statements, you can imagine, broadly speaking, are either implicit or explicit. And what I mean by that is an explicit thesis statement. And don't think when you hear a word like explicit, it has, I don't know, foul language in it or whatever. When I use a word like explicit to describe a thesis statement, I simply mean it is incredibly clear. It is positioned in a place that most readers would expect. For example, if you imagine a 5-paragraph essay, this is the model or form that a lot of students are taught in middle school, high school, etc. And I want to be clear about this. It is a useful model, but it's not the only way to write, develop, articulate, and introduce a thesis. A narrative essay, for example, may not work with that traditional 5-paragraph model form because you are primarily in a narrative essay using storytelling as the primary pattern of development. Therefore, positioning your thesis at, for example, the end of the introduction. This is where someone would expect to find a thesis statement in a traditional 5-paragraph model essay. That may not necessarily work. That might feel a bit forced. It might feel clunky. It might feel like something you as the writer, again, forcefully inserted into an introduction where it may not necessarily fit. But when I use language like an explicit thesis, that's precisely what I mean, is adhering to certain standards and expectations that a reader might know, anticipate, be familiar with. A more implicit thesis statement, by contrast, may not necessarily be positioned where a reader might expect it. You could even argue that an implicit thesis statement is an idea or a feeling, vibe, or sensation that someone extracts from your essay after reading it. So, because of this, and one of the things that you might notice, especially if you read what I want you to read in this unit carefully, is that to varying degrees, all 3 of the narrative essays that I want you to read, if we were to map or plot the thesis statement on a kind of implicit, explicit continuum, they're far more implicit than they are explicit. And because of that, an implicit thesis statement asks more of a reader. An implicit thesis statement asks a reader to perhaps read carefully, pay closer attention. I say all of this because I think this is an excellent way of just initially thinking about thesis statements, how to write them, how to present them, how to introduce them in your essay. And again, think carefully about how form dictates content. And what I mean by that is, if you have an essay that you know is primarily or principally a narrative essay, as I mentioned just a moment ago, it might feel a little awkward to attempt to insert a thesis into the introduction in a way that someone might expect or anticipate from a more traditional 5-paragraph model essay. Because of that, you might find that to successfully write this essay, you obviously need to have some point. You're arguing or developing a point, but you may want to play with thesis statement placement. You may want to challenge your reader or ask more of your reader. I suppose what I'm attempting to say is the work we do here in Comp 1 is work that affords certain opportunities for you, maybe opportunities you have not had in the past. And one of the ways that you can think about those opportunities, one of the invitations is to at times, perhaps, use that reliable, predictable 5-paragraph model for thesis statement development, but you may want to try something different. Think of this essay as an opportunity to try something different if you want. There's one other thing that I mentioned on the prompt that I want to bring to your attention, this carefully chosen language, specifically descriptive, carefully chosen language. Again, this is one of those times where form dictates content. Because I want you to write a narrative essay, because I want you to use the tools and characteristics of storytelling, being descriptive is incredibly important, because with a narrative essay, showing and not telling, this is a rudimentary principle, but as you'll see when I discuss the Orwell essay, it's such an important principle, because if all you do throughout your essay is tell your reader what they should know, I would argue you are not successfully adhering to what a strong narrative essay wants and requires. And again, I'll demonstrate this by quoting directly from the Orwell piece in just a minute, but please keep that in mind. And for any of you who might understandably describe yourself as bad writers, I want to say this now, and again, I'll repeat this throughout the semester. Good writers are good editors. This idea that that writing and being either a good or a bad writer is a matter of just, kind of a binary configuration. Either you're good or you're bad. I would encourage you to reject that premise. I think there are certainly some people who are just naturally talented at writing and some people who are less, naturally talented, whatever the hell that means. But from my experience teaching writing, the best writers that I've taught are those who understand the importance of the editing process. And they understand that whatever they do with their first draft, that's just a first draft. That's not the final draft. And whatever work they do in their initial draft, that's creating some kind of a foundation that they can build upon. And the importance here that I want to emphasize is the building is the editing itself. And when you write your first draft, you might have these moments where you tell more than you show. Those are moments that are often quite easy to correct, but you must create the time to do the editing to actually correct them. So please keep that in mind as well. And again, I'll return to that concept throughout the semester. A few additional things to note. The minimum word count for this essay is 900 words. You may exceed that minimum word count, but for full consideration, you need to write at least 900 words. You will also submit this essay through D2L. You'll submit a digital copy, and you will do that through the Assignments tab. You can also see language here about adhering to MLA documentation standards. Since this is not a research essay, you will not need to create a works cited page, but if you go to the Content tab in the Course Documents module, you should see a document that I have labeled MLA First Page that offers some guidance about what it means to adhere to MLA documentation standards. But here I'll just say it: double space your work, choose an inoffensive font. If I get any weird like Comic Sans or Papyrus or something like that, like, guys, this isn't a hookah bar, what are you doing? Choose something inoffensive like Times New Roman. Aside from that, you should be fine. I am particularly fussy about the double spacing. It just makes grading easier, so please ensure that your essay is double spaced before you submit a final draft. Okay, so we just discussed, in summary, the Essay 1 assignment prompt. I spent a bit of time discussing thesis statements and the importance of showing and not telling. So now I would like to transition to the George Orwell essay, A Hanging, which is also in the Essay 1 module. If you would, go have it open. I would encourage you to follow along as I discuss it, because that'll be the best way to really understand what I mean, because I will quote directly from the text, but it's always great to have the text in front of you. Okay, as I said a moment ago, the reading is important. It's important for a few different reasons. You'll notice that you have often weekly discussion responsibilities, most of those discussions, especially during the weeks when I assign reading, some of the questions will ask you to address particular aspects or facets of the reading. It's incredibly hard to do that if you don't actually do the reading, but I think most important for you, because this is, again, a writing class primarily, the reading I ask you to do functions and operates as examples. But please don't think that my standard or expectation for you is you write an essay as good as George Orwell, because he's George Orwell, and very few of us are George Orwell. So again, this is not my expectation. This is more of a guide and an example. And I want to start with the introduction, with these opening couple of paragraphs, because I think what Orwell does, especially for you in this class, he offers an example of how to begin a narrative essay when narration and description are your primary patterns of development. There are certain expectations. Orwell offers an example of what those expectations can and perhaps should look like. So I'll read the opening paragraph and then I'll pause and say a bit about it. It was in Burma, a sodden morning of the rains. A sickly light, like yellow tin foil, was slanting over the high walls into the jail yard. We were waiting outside the condemned cells, a row of sheds fronted with double bars, like small animal cages. Each cell measured about 10 feet by 10 and was quite bare within, except for a plank bed and a pot of drinking water. In some of them, brown silent men were squatting at the inner bars, with their blankets draped round them. These were the condemned men due to be hanged within the next week or two. So, if you can and would like to do this, I would encourage you to pause for just a second. Pause and really think about what we just read. Specifically, I would ask you to think about the words Orwell uses. And if you had a physical copy in front of you, you could circle, highlight particular words, because I think Orwell does a lot of showing and not telling here. I'll give you some examples. Notice how, in that second sentence, a sickly light like yellow tin foil was slanting over the high walls into the jail yard. Think about what feeling this communicates, especially if you pair it with the opening sentence to this essay. It was in Burma, a sodden morning of the rains. This is not a place that feels good. It feels bad. If we were, for example, telling, we would probably say, this place feels bad, looks bad, no one is having a good time. However, that is not what Orwell does here. He doesn't tell you that, he shows you that. But what's really interesting is he still communicates this idea, but this is an example of what I mean by carefully chosen descriptive language. Orwell, if you, again, just think about what I just said, that example of how one could tell this feeling, both that example and what Orwell gives us communicate the same idea. But what Orwell gives us is something far more interesting, descriptive, thought-provoking. Even if you just pause for a minute and think about this as a way of starting, there's something so provocative about this introduction. I think you could argue it encourages you as a reader to continue reading. Again, George Orwell is very good at this. But we can say more about this introduction. Notice, for example, the size of the cages, 10 by 10, quite bare within, except for a plank bed and a pot of drinking water. This is small, confined. Again, if one were telling, that's perhaps what one would say. Orwell communicates this idea, but he communicates it by showing it to us. He's creating this picture of this environment. And that is what is interesting about this essay, how important the environment is. You'll also notice the use of the word condemned. This is something Orwell, especially in the introduction, repeats. This is an excellent example of how repetition, when deployed strategically, is thought-provoking, because the word condemned is such a specific and obviously deliberately chosen word. Because think about what a word like condemned suggests. When I talk to my students about this in a more traditional 10-10 environment where we are in the same classroom, I'll always have a student say, well, we use the word condemn to like describe places or like a house or something. And then I'll ask, well, what does that mean? Like, does anyone know what it means to condemn a house? And someone will always say, well, it means like we should just tear it down, I suppose. And that's exactly right. If you or if a city or whatever declares something condemned, it's beyond that point. It's reached beyond that point where it could be refurbished or repaired. There's something about the word condemned that has this finality to it. Orwell uses this word deliberately in the introduction because whether we know it or not, and I think this is the kind of thing you only realize after reading the essay, he just told us everything we need to know. This is like in a detective story, seeing the person who commits the murder without any of the other characters knowing it. We, as the audience, if we pay attention, we just learned everything we need to know about this essay. This is an essay about condemned men who are condemned to die. And there's no retribution, there's no salvation here. Orwell embeds that idea in the introduction, but he does it in such a subtle way that you would and should be forgiven for missing it. Now, if we continue to the second paragraph, Orwell builds on these ideas from the introduction. This is what he writes. One prisoner had been brought out of his cell. He was a Hindu, a puny wisp of a man with a shaven head and vague, liquid eyes. He had a thick, sprouting mustache, absurdly too big for his body, rather like the mustache of a comic man on the films. 6 tall Indian warders were guarding him and getting him ready for the gallows. 2 of them stood by with rifles and fixed bayonets, while the others handcuffed him, passed a chain through his handcuffs and fixed it to their belts and lashed his arms tight to his sides. They crowded very close about him, with their hands always on him in a careful, caressing grip, as though all the while feeling him to make sure he was there. It was like men handling a fish, which is still alive and may jump back into the water, but he stood quite unresisting, yielding his arms limply to the ropes, as though he hardly noticed what was happening. So Orwell effectively uses exaggeration at times here in this second paragraph to communicate the size or the lack of size of this condemned man. This speaks, and there's a couple of possible ways to interpret this, but notice how Orwell effectively communicates this idea by suggesting that his mustache is just almost like comedically too big for his body. This might, for example, speak to the conditions in this particular jail. Again, back to this idea of condemnation. What do we do with and to that which is condemned? We do not try to nourish it or refurbish it, because it's condemned. Again, this word condemned from the previous paragraph does a lot of work to potentially explain why this person's body is so small. It's because he's a condemned man. And again, think back to what I said just a moment ago about what a word like condemned and what condemnation as a notion does, how it perhaps affects the way we think about things, and in this situation, how we might think about people and a person. But what I also think is interesting about this paragraph is how all the guards behave. So for someone as small, diminutive, and unassuming as this prisoner is, he seems to have a lot of people, a lot of armed, it seems, people there to tend to him, to watch him. And I always enjoy discussing this with students in class because some students, I think, naturally, and I don't necessarily have the correct answer or a correct answer, but because again, I think there's multiple interpretations, but I have a lot of students who say, well, perhaps this speaks to exactly how dangerous this person is. This is a person who requires so many guards and such a large number of people because this is a really dangerous person. And I think that's possibly true. What I do think is interesting, and I always like to think about, well, what are the gaps of information that exist in a text? We never know or learn what this man did or allegedly did. He's just a condemned man. So that's a reasonable interpretation. I think another possible reasonable interpretation is, well, this is just how they do things. And why would we do something different to accommodate the potential threat of someone if because if you imagine, for example, that this is especially based on his physicality, a person who may not necessarily pose much, if any, of a threat, well, sure, we could perhaps employ or deploy fewer guards to watch him, but that's not how we do things. So Orwell, I think here at the very beginning, he introduces this notion of conformity, or we could possibly interpret that he introduces this notion of conformity because this becomes an important idea by the end of the essay. So I'll return to that point about conformity later, but I would encourage you, again, pay close attention to the work Orwell does here because there's very little telling in these opening paragraphs. Orwell effectively uses descriptive language. He creates the sense and feeling of an environment, but he also gestures toward some important ideas and concepts that he will later develop in the essay. Now, from here, I'll jump around a little bit. I think a couple of important moments before they take this man to the gallows is when there is this dog that seems to interrupt this whole process. And I would encourage you to think carefully about, well, what's the significance of the dog gravitating towards the prisoner and away from the guards? And I believe the language Orwell uses, the dog almost seems frightened by these guards. I think it's interesting how we have this narrative about dogs that they have this way of sensing whether or not a person is someone who they can trust, and maybe by extension we should trust. And again, I don't know the degree to which this is true, but it's certainly a story or narrative we tell ourselves about dogs, is that they just have this sense about people. They seem to know. And if we take that idea and map it onto this moment, it's interesting how the dog gravitates towards the prisoner and not the guards, possibly inverting our assumptions about the figures and characters in this essay. Perhaps, Orwell wants to suggest, we should not be that worried and concerned about the prisoner. Perhaps what he suggests here is we should be worried and concerned about these guards. That, I think, again, is an interesting subversion of expectations. The second moment, and this is a moment that provokes Orwell's narrator into philosophizing about the nature of what it means to be a person. It's when the prisoner avoids the puddle. And again, because this prisoner does not have the privilege of narrating his own experience, we're left to just wonder and speculate, well, why did he avoid the puddle? Because I think Orwell asks a similar sort of question because it does seem odd, and I believe the word he uses is curious. So here, again, I'm down a few additional paragraphs, but this is what Orwell writes. It is curious, but till that moment I had never realized what it means to destroy a healthy, conscious man. When I saw the prisoner step aside to avoid the puddle, I saw the mystery, the unspeakable wrongness of cutting a life short when it is in full tide. This man was not dying, he was alive, just as we were alive. All the organs of his body were working, bowels digesting food, skin renewing itself, nails growing, tissues forming. all toiling away in solemn foolery. His nails would still be growing when he stood on the drop, when he was falling through the air with a tenth of a second to live. His eyes saw the yellow gravel and the gray walls, and his brain still remembered, foresaw, reasoned even about puddles. He and we were a party of men walking together, seeing, hearing, feeling, understanding the same world. And in 2 minutes, with a sudden snap, one of us would be gone, one mind less, one world less. So, again, why this prisoner avoided the puddle, we do not know, and we cannot know. But I think of all the possibilities, they speak to and support what Orwell's narrator articulates in the passage I just read, which is, despite all of these efforts to make this condemned man seem less like a person, even in those few moments before his inevitable death, he showed and demonstrated his unmistakable humanity. And I think this moment, again, has this cascading effect on everything we have read to this point, because it is fascinating how difficult and challenging it is, I would argue, for most people to just kill a person. I don't think this is something that is incredibly easy to do, and I think there's a lot of work often that we must do if and when we find ourselves in a situation like that to ultimately decide to do that, and maybe more importantly, to then rationalize why doing that is the right thing to do. And I think for Orwell in this specific moment, what this cascading effect does, it brings to our attention why there's all of this work to show and to suggest that this prisoner is someone who, for lack of a better phrase, deserves this. Because again, think about what a word like condemned does. Why should we feel any compunction about being complicit in the death of a person when, well, they're condemned? So it is as if they're not really a person at that point. And even if we think about how these men, these prisoners, are treated, all of it does the work of suggesting that, well, these are not really people. Who would put someone in a cell that small? Who would treat someone like that, in theory, to the point that their body would shrink to the size of this man's body? Well, one explanation is, if we treat them like this, if we think of them like this, if they appear like this, then it's almost like we're not really killing a person. And I think Orwell's narrator articulates, well, despite all of these mechanisms in place to make us feel like this is not actually a person, no, the inherent, unmistakable humanity of this person, it just finds its way to the surface. It's something that is, at least for Orwell's narrator, impossible to ignore, impossible to compartmentalize. And all of this sounds great, right? But the essay does not end here. And this is why, where you choose to end your essay, or any written assignment, whatever it might be, where you choose to end is so important. Because there's something possibly optimistic about this paragraph. You could imagine the essay ending here, and we as readers might have so many different questions. Like, was this a moment of radical reformation for Orwell? Did he perhaps conspire to help free this prisoner? There's something about this paragraph that, if this were the end of this piece, it would fundamentally change the larger point that Orwell wants to make. But the essay does not end here. There's no heroic moment. The prisoner dies, and I always ask my students, is that something you expected or anticipated, especially after this paragraph? Because I have a lot of students who, while reading this essay, they arrive at this paragraph and think, oh my God, this is one of these like really interesting essays about a person defying authority. But that's not what this essay is about. In fact, it's about the complete opposite of that, because notice how the essay ends. It ends with all of these men laughing and joking and drinking. Perhaps you can imagine that both jokes and alcohol are sedatives in some ways. Orwell concludes the essay with the following lines. We all had a drink together, native and European alike, quite amicably. The dead man was 100 yards away. So there is this interesting formation occurring at the end of the essay. It is as if, it seems for Orwell, the lack of proximity to the prisoner's body means that he is both literally and figuratively further and further away from this radical realization that we just read and discussed a few moments ago. It's as if, despite everything he seemed to learn, that was just a moment. And then what do we do with those moments? And I think a lot of us have moments like this in our lives when something truly radical and potentially life-altering happens to us. And sometimes we make changes, but I would encourage all of you to think about those moments if they've occurred in your life. And did they really provoke radical change? Or is it possible that, given a bit of time, you just fell or slid back into previous behaviors? Maybe the sorts of behavioral patterns that this radical moment that you hoped would break you from that kind of behavior. I think this is an essay that effectively explores just how difficult it is to rebel. This is an interesting essay that explores how rebellion always looks, feels, and sounds great in the moment, but there's always tomorrow. And this is, it seems, an essay that wants to articulate how those moments, those radical moments, while they're important, if they're not coupled with consistent acts and behavior that works to change, whether it's personal behavioral patterns, larger systemic behavioral patterns, if we don't pair those two things together, most people will probably just slide back into the behavioral patterns that they hope to rebel against when those radical moments presented themselves. So again, I think what we see in this essay, if we think back to what I said earlier about thesis statements, it would be very difficult to find a particular passage, especially at the end of the introduction, that effectively articulates all the things that I just discussed. And that's because I think Orwell wants more from this essay. Not that he was working from or rebelling against a traditional 5-paragraph model, but it's clear that Orwell wants to do something more dynamic with the point he wants to make. He's asking his reader to stay and follow him through this particular experience until the very end, because it's not until the end, I would argue, that it becomes clear what this essay is ultimately about. Again, as I said a moment ago, this is not an essay about how one moment can change your life. This is an essay about how one moment, as radical and potentially revolutionary as it was really just that. And after this moment, Orwell's narrator retreated back into older patterns. So, okay, if you have any questions, if you have anything that you want me to address in more detail, do not hesitate to contact me. Okay, I think that's everything I wanted to say for this first lecture. Thank you so much for listening. And this is Colin Cox from Northeast State Community College. Have a nice day.